The judge lifted a basket of potatoes the size of a man's fist and could not speak. The long table behind him bent under squash and beans and tomatoes that shamed every other entry at the Grover County Fair. People pressed close, whispering one name. A year before, those same people had laughed until they wept. Nora Calloway only smiled and waited. Dale Pruitt said it on a Tuesday morning in April, standing at her fence with his clean Stetson and his unscuffed boots, and his voice pitched loud enough to carry across the yard. "Mrs. Calloway, I will be direct with you. That ground is dead. You are just the last one to know it." She did not answer him. He looked at her for one moment, the way a man looks at a door he already owns and has not yet bothered to unlock, then turned and walked back to his Buick. She watched the car until it disappeared around the bend in the county road, and then she was alone again with the sound of the wind moving through nothing, because there was nothing left in her fields tall enough to catch it. He had been saying some version of that sentence for 3 years. He had been wrong for 3 years. He did not know that yet. The Calloway place sat on the eastern edge of Grover County, Kansas, a narrow strip of ground that Roy's father had broken with a 2-bottom plow in the years before the war, and that Roy himself had worked from the time he was old enough to follow a furrow. For most of those years, the land had answered. It grew corn shoulder high by July, stood thick and dark, and almost loud with it, the kind of field that made a man feel he had done something worth doing. Roy kept records of every season in a small leather notebook, the covers worn pale at the corners from being carried in his back pocket through 30 years of work. He wrote down planting dates, first frost, the price per bushel at the grain elevator in town, the weight of the harvest off each individual section. He wrote in a cramped and careful hand that left nothing out. The first page said in different ink and written larger than the rest, "First season hers and mine together." Roy died 3 winters back, in the 2nd year of the drought that had come and settled over the county, like something that meant to stay. He was 67. Nora had turned 64 the October before, and had spent the months since learning what it meant to run 40 acres without him. What it meant was this. She milked the 1 cow at 5 in the morning, gathered eggs from 14 hens, weeded the kitchen garden beds that gave back less. Each season sold butter and the odd dozen eggs at the Grover Mercantile, and sat at her kitchen table under the lamp at night, counting coins and watching the pile shrink. The corn was gone. She did not have the capital to hire equipment for a corn season, and had not, since Roy's last hospital winter, so she had planted in vegetables instead smaller beds. She could work by hand, beans and squash, and potatoes meant to sell retail. The soil did not cooperate. Where the corn had grown, the dirt had packed and grayed and gone dense as fired clay, and the vegetables she put into it came up thin and reluctant and small. She had tried everything Roy's notebooks recommended. She had tried the county extension advice. The ground did not care. It just kept dying a little more each season, a little more faithfully than she could afford. In the kitchen drawer beside the sink, she kept Roy's leather notebook. She had not opened it since the funeral. She was not ready for his handwriting yet, the careful, specific way he recorded things, the way every number was written twice if he was unsure, checked against itself. She was not ready for any of that. So the notebook stayed in the drawer, and Nora stayed at the fence in the evenings, crumbling the gray dirt between her fingers and watching it fall away into nothing. Across the road and down 3/4 of a mile, in the best situated acreage in the township, Dale Pruitt ran the Grover Seed and Feed. He was a wide man in his early 60s, with silver hair, combed back smooth, and a handshake he deployed like a tool firm enough to remind you he was stronger, and loose enough to remind you he had chosen not to use it. He had built his standing in Grover County on a simple arrangement. He sold the seed everyone planted, carried the feed everyone bought, and held paper on 14 farm operations in the township that had come to him in dry years needing credit. His word on agricultural matters was as close to law as anything unwritten could be, because no one in living memory had profited from disagreeing with it. He had made Nora 3 offers on the Calloway place. The first came 6 months after Roy's funeral, framed as concern. The second came the following spring, framed as practicality. The third came that April morning and was framed as nothing at all because by then, Pruitt had stopped bothering to frame things for her. Each offer had been lower than the one before. She had refused all 3 without discussing the numbers. Pruitt absorbed each refusal the way a man absorbs weather with patience, and the certainty that conditions would eventually change in his favor. What Nora did not know on that Tuesday morning, standing at the fence, watching his Buick recede, was that Pruitt had already moved. 2 days earlier, he had walked into the Grover Mercantile and made a quiet arrangement with Harold Mercer, who ran the store and had been carrying Nora's account on good faith for 14 months. The total came to $1,240. Pruitt paid it that same afternoon in cash. He held the paper now. The debt was his. He came back to the Calloway place 3 days later. This time, he did not stay at the fence. He walked through the gate without asking and stood in her yard with a folded document held between 2 fingers, like something he had almost forgotten to mention. He told her what he had done in the same tone he might use to discuss rainfall. He told her the debt was payable to him directly now in full by the 1st of October. If she could not meet it, he would take the matter to the county court. October 1st was 14 weeks away. Her garden was gray and still and barely breathing. She took the document from him and read it standing in the yard with the sun on her face and the chickens moving behind her in the dust. She read every line, then she handed it back. Pruitt blinked once. That was not the response he had planned for. She went inside and let the screen door close behind her. She listened to his footsteps cross the yard, heard the car door, heard the engine turn over and back down the drive. Then she went to the kitchen counter and picked up the old Polaroid camera Roy had used for farm records and took a clear photograph of the folded document she had already memorized. Because you did not survive 30 years of farming without understanding that the moment you needed a piece of paper was always the moment you no longer had it. She set the photograph on the counter and looked at it for a long time. 14 weeks. $1,240. A garden that had nothing left to give. She thought about the cow. She thought about the hens. She thought about the 6 jars of preserved beans on the cellar shelf and the 3 dozen eggs in the box by the door and the $11 and some cents in the coffee can above the refrigerator. She did the arithmetic the way Roy had always done it, slowly and twice, and both times it came out the same. It was not enough. Not even close to enough. The following morning, Clem Bassett came up her lane, waving his hat, before she had finished her coffee. Clem lived 3/4 of a mile north, along the creek that ran behind the Calloway property, in a low white house that he had built himself in 1959 and had been meaning to repaint for 20 years. He was 74 years old and had farmed Grover County for 55 of those years and had lost most of the hearing in that span to machinery and weather, and the sheer accumulated noise of working land. When Clem spoke, he spoke too loud because he could not hear himself well enough to calibrate. People in town had long ago decided this meant he was simple. Nora had known better from the first month after Roy died, when Clem began appearing with blackberries in June and apples in August, and nothing expected in return except the chance to sit on the porch and talk. And she had noticed that when she spoke, he listened with his whole face, the way people listen when they are not waiting for their turn. He noticed things other people did not think to notice. He could read rain in the angle of a swallow's wing. He could name a weed from its first leaf before it had any business being identified. He pressed his hands into soil the way a doctor presses a chest, feeling for something underneath the surface. Roy had trusted him completely, and Roy had been right about people in the way that men who say little often are. That morning, Clem came up the lane faster than usual for a man his age, his hat going back and forth like a flag. She met him at the gate. He had heard something at the grain elevator the afternoon before. The hatchery on the south end of town had taken an order from a buyer in Wichita, 200 day-old chicks the buyer had backed out the day they hatched. Railroad delay changed plans nobody knew exactly. The hatchery man had 180 live chicks eating his feed with no destination, and a deadline of Sunday before the cost of keeping them outweighed the cost of letting them go. He would practically give them away to anyone who would take the lot. Nora asked what she would do with 180 chickens. Clem's eyes went to the dead beds behind her. "Feed them," he said, his voice coming out louder than the morning required. "Feed them, and let them feed you back." Chickens scratch, Nora. They eat bugs. They eat weed seed. And what comes out the back end of a chicken is the best soil amendment the Lord ever designed for ground that has given up. You put those birds on your dead beds on a rotation, and in one season, that dirt will not know itself. She laughed. She laughed because it was early and she had not slept well, and the image of herself managing 180 chickens on a dead farm in Kansas was genuinely funny, in the way that desperate things sometimes are. But that night she did not sleep at all. She lay in the dark and thought about the document on the counter, and about October 1st, and about 14 weeks, and about what the ground had produced last season and what it would need to produce this season to make up the difference. She thought about the catalog advice she had followed, and the extension recommendations she had tried, and the careful notes Roy had kept on everything that had worked, and everything that had not. She thought about what Clem had said. Not the chickens specifically, the principle. That tired ground needed what lived things produced. That the relationship between an animal and the soil it walked on was not incidental. That it was the whole point. She drove into town before 8. The hatchery sat behind the depot in a long, low building that announced itself by sound and smell before she pulled her truck alongside the loading dock. The man who ran it was named Greer, in his 50s, with the look of someone who had been solving problems since before breakfast and expected more problems by lunch. He led her to the back room without ceremony, and she stopped in the doorway. 180 chicks occupied every crate and box and flat surface, in a back room roughly the size of her pantry. They were 4 days old and yellow and loud, and each one was approximately the size of a plum, and burning through feed at a rate Greer found personally offensive. He did not want to discuss the price at length. He wanted them gone by Friday. He would include the remaining feed sacks. The crates were hers to keep. Nora stood in the doorway and did the arithmetic. 180 mouths. Her granary was low, and what she had was meant for the cow and the hens. She had no proper coop that could manage this number, no fencing adequate to contain them, no established system for keeping a flock this size through a hard rain. If she bought them and they died, she would have spent money she could not recover on a yard full of small corpses and the kind of story that travels fast in a small county. Pruitt would hear it by Sunday, and it would confirm everything he had ever said about her. The women at church would ask in that particular gentle way, the one that cuts deepest, whether she was managing all right out there alone. She stood in the doorway a long time. Greer waited. He had been in business long enough to know that the ones who stood and thought were more reliable than the ones who decided fast. She thought about what Clem had said. She thought about the notebook in the drawer and about Roy's first entry, and what it had meant for him to write hers and mine together on the first page of 30 years of careful record. She thought about October 1st and about what the same thinking she had been doing for 3 years would produce in 3 more years exactly. How soon, she said. Would I need to take them? Greer said he could have the crates loaded in her truck within the hour. She took them. The drive home was something she would not forget. 180 chicks in stacked crates in the truck bed, every one of them expressing a strong opinion about the journey, the morning coming on, warm and bright around her, while she sat behind the wheel and wondered at considerable length what she had just done. The cost of them had taken most of what was in the coffee can. She was not frightened exactly. Frightened was what you were before you jumped. She had jumped. This was what came after. Clem met her at the gate. He looked at the truck bed. He sat down on the mounting block and laughed until he had to hold his hat on. You went and did it, he said. I went and did it, she said, and her voice was shaking somewhere between terror and a feeling she had not felt in longer than she could account for something that belonged to the same family as hope. They carried the crates into the lean-to off the barn where the light came in south-facing and the wind did not get under the boards. The chicks spread across the straw in a moving yellow sheet. Clem showed her how to keep a low heat without risk of fire, how to bruise the grain so the smallest could manage it, how to touch each beak gently to the water so it understood where the water was. He had a way of working without wasted motion that came from decades of knowing exactly what a thing needed. In watching him cup a struggling chick in his broad, weathered hands, she felt again the particular anger she always felt on his behalf when she thought of how the town talked past him, how they spoke loudly and slowly to a man who could outread any of them when it came to the things that mattered. The first problem was immediate and had no easy answer. 180 chickens loose on her property would strip every growing thing bare inside a week. Kept in a fixed pen, they would convert that ground to bare-packed mud, and everything they produced in the way of manure would land on earth she was not trying to improve. She needed them on the dead beds, specifically on the dead beds, and she needed them to move. She sat at the kitchen table after supper with a stub of pencil and the back of a flour sack and worked through it. The ground needed what the birds made, the scratching, the bug consumption. The biological material worked into the surface. The birds needed new ground under them regularly, or they overstayed and compacted what they had improved. The solution was motion. Not free motion, which would be chaos, but controlled motion. A pen with no fixed floor, a pen that could be moved. She thought about Roy's hay rake, rusting in the barn corner. She thought about the scrap lumber stacked against the east wall. She thought about the coil of wire in Clem's shed that he had mentioned once and never explained. She drew the shape on the flour sack. Long and low, open at the bottom, screened sides for air and visibility, peaked roof to shed rain, a small hinged door at one end for access. Wheels at the back, 2 long handles at the front, so it moved like a wheelbarrow. No floor. The ground itself would be the floor, a different section of ground every day. She took the drawing to Clem the next morning, half expecting him to find the flaw she had missed. He went quiet in the way he did when something caught him. He looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he looked at her beds, then back at the drawing. Move it across a bed, he said. Let them work it. Roll it forward onto the next section when the first is done. You stagger 3 of them down a long bed in a line, leapfrogging one ahead, and you have continuous ground improvement ahead of your planting. He paused. That is real clever, Nora, he said. That is just real clever. They built the first one that afternoon from the barn scrap and the hay rake wheels, in the wire from Clem's shed that had been waiting 40 years for exactly this application. The thing they produced was not beautiful. It listed slightly to the left, and the roof peak was not quite centered, and one handle was 2 inches longer than the other. But it moved. She put 20 of the largest chicks in it and set it over the worst of her dead beds, the section nearest the south fence, that had not produced anything worth harvesting in 4 years, and stood back. The birds did not know they had been assigned a task. They knew only that there was ground beneath them, and that ground was interesting. They fell to it with their full attention, scratching the gray, packed surface loose, snapping up the sow bugs and cutworms that had been living unmolested in her soil for 3 dry seasons. They ate the weed seedlings down to nothing. They dusted themselves in the broken crust and made a considerable fuss about the whole enterprise. And everywhere they walked, they left the biological amendment that Clem had sworn by, worked into the scratched and opened surface. By evening, the patch beneath the pen, hard gray clay that morning, had turned to a soft, dark crumble she could push her fingers into. She knelt in the last light and pressed both hands flat against the turned earth, and felt it actually give under her weight. And the feeling was so different from everything she had touched in this ground for 3 years that she stayed there on her knees in the cooling air, long after there was any practical reason to. She rolled the pen 6 feet forward, onto the next section of bed before she went in. The following Thursday evening, a knock at the screen door found Nora still at the kitchen table with her planting notes. She went to the door and found Vera Sims standing on the porch step with her hands clasped in front of her, and a look that was trying to be casual and not quite managing it. Vera was 34, married to Pete Sims, who ran 200 acres on the west side of the county, and owed Dale Pruitt $8,000 from the hard year 3 seasons back. She and Nora were not close, the way women in a small rural county are sometimes not close when their husbands occupy different positions in the local financial order. They spoke at church and at the mercantile, and that was the extent of it. Vera said she had heard about the chickens. Said she had been by on the road twice and seen the pens. Said she hoped Nora did not mind her stopping. Nora opened the screen door and told her to come in. Vera sat at the table and accepted coffee and looked at the sketches and the flour sack, drawing, and the notes on rotational timing. She asked specific questions, not general ones. She wanted to know the wheel diameter. She wanted to know how Nora had secured the wire to the frame without gaps large enough for a chick to push through. She wrote down the answers in a small notepad she produced from her jacket pocket. Then she said, without looking up from the notepad, "Pete does not know I am here. I would ask you not to mention it if you see him." Nora looked at her across the table. Vera met her eyes for a moment and then looked back at her notes. "He is worried about what Pruitt will say if he sees us connected to your operation. Pruitt has been talking to the men at the feed store. Pete heard some of it. He thinks it is better to keep clear until he knows which way this goes." Nora said she understood. Vera closed the notepad and put it back in her jacket. She stood and thanked Nora for the coffee. At the screen door, she paused with her hand on the frame and asked the question she had come to ask the one underneath all the specific questions about wire gauge and wheel diameter. "Do you actually think it will work?" she said. "The pens, the soil." Nora looked at the kitchen window, which faced the south beds, though she could not see them in the dark. She thought about the handful of earth she had pressed between her palms 2 evenings ago, the way it had given the way it had smelled of something living underneath. "I think the old way was sinking me," she said, slowly and politely and right on schedule. "I do not know for certain that this works, but I know the other thing does not." Vera nodded once, precise and firm, the way a person nods when they have heard the answer they came for and is not sure yet what to do with it. Then she crossed the yard and got in her car and drove away down the dark county road, and Nora watched the taillights until they rounded the bend, and then she went back to her table and her notes and the one pen she had built, and the 159 birds still waiting for pens of their own. 14 weeks to October 1st. One pen built 4 more to go. 120 linear feet of dead beds waiting. She picked up the pencil and began to calculate. She built the second pen in 2 days. The third in a day and a half. Her hands stopped asking questions and started knowing answers, the lumber fitting together the way it was supposed to fit, the wire, running clean and taut without the small adjustments she had needed on the first one. By the end of the 3rd week, she had 4 pens moving in on a staggered line down the long south beds, leapfrogging one ahead of the other, the way Clem had described, so that the garden was always being worked somewhere and resting somewhere else, and planted behind where it had already been worked. The chicks were not chicks anymore. They had the angular, half-formed look of adolescence, somewhere between the yellow fluff of their first days and the settled, glossy weight of full-grown birds, and they scratched and disputed and reorganized themselves constantly, and converted everything she fed them into the dark, crumbling material that was spreading down her beds like a tide coming in behind the moving pens. She planted beans into the first finished section on a Tuesday morning, and by Friday, every single seed had broken through. She stood over the row and counted the seedlings twice, because the number seemed wrong and she wanted to be sure. Every seed had taken. Every plant stood thick-stemmed and a color of green she had not seen in this dirt in 4 years. Clem came each morning and they worked side by side, without much need for talking, which suited them both. He had a way of arriving with exactly what was needed, a particular tool she had not thought to look for, a length of spare wire, once a jar of his late wife's preserved tomatoes that he set on the porch rail without explanation. She accepted it the same way without explanation. Some working relationships operate below the level of language and are better for it. The 5th pen design had been in her head for 2 weeks before she had time to build it. The problem was moving the birds from one section to the next without opening the pen fully and losing half the flock to the surrounding beds. She needed a sliding panel in the side wall low to the ground that could be opened onto the new section, while the far end of the pen was temporarily blocked so the birds would move forward into fresh ground on their own rather than being chased. She had described it to Clem 3 times in the evenings, and each time he had nodded in the way he nodded when something seemed right in principle and needed proving in practice. She did not get the chance to build it before Clem stopped coming. The first morning he did not appear. She assumed weather, though the sky was clear. The second morning, she went to the creek path and looked north, and the path was empty. On the 3rd morning, she walked the 3/4 of a mile to his house and found him on the porch in his wooden chair, with his back held very straight, and his face arranged in the expression of a man who has decided not to make a fuss about something that deserves one. His back. The old compression problem in the lower spine that he had not mentioned, because he did not mention things like that. He said it had happened before, and it would ease, and he would be over directly. He said it as though he were discussing a fence post that needed resetting. She went inside and made coffee from his kitchen and brought it out and sat on the step below his chair. He was not a man who accepted help easily. She did not offer it directly. She sat and drank her coffee and told him about the 5th pen, the sliding panel problem, the angle she could not work out for the track that would let the panel move smoothly without binding in wet weather. He listened with his whole face the way he always did. After a while, he reached to the side table where his morning newspaper sat folded, and he picked up the stub of pencil that lived beside it, and he drew on the margin of the back page a small, precise diagram of a recessed track notched at the bottom edge so water would drain rather than pool with the panel hung slightly inside the frame, rather than flush, so the swelling of wet wood would tighten the fit rather than jam it. He held the paper out to her without comment. She looked at the drawing for a long time. It solved the problem entirely, and it solved it in a way she would not have found on her own for at least another week of wrong attempts. She folded the newspaper margin carefully and put it in her shirt pocket. She refilled his coffee from the pot she had brought out and walked home through the warm morning and built the 5th pen that afternoon from the drawing in her pocket, and it ran true on the first test. The panel sliding clean in its recessed track, while the birds moved forward into new ground without a single one turning back. When Clem came back 4 days later, moving carefully, but moving she was running all 5 pens in sequence, and the planted sections behind them were so visibly different from everything else in the county that she had already stopped trying to describe it to people and had started simply pointing. The beans were 3 inches high and dark. The squash had set its first blossoms. The potato plants were bushing out, thick and low and strong, their leaves the deep, waxy green of plants that have everything they need. She had started keeping her own records, now filling the back pages of a composition book with planting dates and germination times and yield estimates row by row, the columns precise and small, the way Roy had taught her, without intending to teach her anything, just by letting her watch him do it for 30 years. Clem stood at the edge of the first finished section for a long time without speaking. Then he pressed one boot into the soil and watched it leave a clean, deep print in the dark crumble. He said, "I farmed this county 55 years. I never saw this ground look like this." She said, "It never had a reason to." The word reached them in early July, the way word always reached people in Grover County, sideways and without attribution. Someone at the feed store mentioned it to someone else, who mentioned it at the post office, who told a neighbor who happened to be driving past the mercantile when Vera Sims came out carrying her week's supplies. Vera came to the farm that evening through the side gate, the same way she had come in April. She stood in the garden between 2 of the moving pens while the evening light went long and golden across the beds and told Nora what she had heard. Pruitt had been talking, not loudly. Pruitt never worked loudly when quietly would serve. He had mentioned at his counter to several men whose opinions circulated that he had some concern about the sanitary conditions on the Callaway operation. All those birds, all that biological material, worked directly into food-producing soil. He was not saying it was dangerous, he had said, with the particular care of a man saying exactly what he means while appearing to say something more cautious. He was just saying he was not sure it was clean. The word had moved the way his words always moved in Grover County, which was efficiently and in all directions at once. Nora had felt the change before she understood its source. Mercer at the mercantile had grown careful about her eggs, had mentioned a customer had asked. 2 women at Sunday service had pressed her hand with a new quality of concern, the worried kind rather than the social kind. Nora listened to all of it, standing between her pens in the evening light without changing her expression. Vera said, "I thought you should know where it was coming from." Nora said, "I knew where it was coming from." Vera looked at the beds, at the dark soil, at the plants, coming on strong in the last of the light. She said, "Pete heard the talk at the feed store. He told me to stay away from here." Nora waited. Vera said, "I am telling you what he said. I am not telling you I agreed." She left through the back gate, and Nora stood in the garden until the light was fully gone, and the bats came out over the beds, hunting the insects. The chickens had not caught, and the garden below her was the greenest thing in Grover County, and smelled of living soil in the cool evening air. And she thought about how a man who had already lost the argument on the merits would naturally look for a way to move the argument somewhere else. The second time Pruitt came to the Callaway place, he did not come alone. He pulled up in the Buick on a Wednesday afternoon in late July with Harold Mercer in the passenger seat, and Nora watched from the kitchen window as both men got out and came through the gate without stopping at the fence first. Mercer had the look of a man who had agreed to something in a comfortable office that felt different now that he was standing in the yard. Nora came out and stood on the porch step. Pruitt said he had been driving past and had thought it only neighborly to stop. He said Harold had been hearing from customers and had some concerns he wanted to raise directly with her. He said this the way he said most things, as though he were doing the other person a favor. Mercer cleared his throat. He said there had been questions about the eggs, whether the production method was, he used the word standard. He said he was not making any accusations. He said he just needed to be comfortable before he went on carrying product. Nora looked at Mercer for a long moment and said nothing to Pruitt. She said to Mercer, "Did you see something yourself, Harold? Or did someone tell you what to think?" Mercer looked at his shoes. The yard was quiet except for the distant sound of the pens and the birds working the far beds. She said, "You have carried my eggs for 2 years. You know what they look like. You know what they taste like. You know what my production conditions are because you have been here twice for Roy's estate business and you have seen the place. Did anything you saw yourself give you a reason?" Mercer did not answer. He had the look of a man who understood. He had walked into a room whose dimensions were different from what he had been told. Pruitt stepped forward slightly and said there was also the matter of the Agricultural Society, which had a responsibility to the public, and that some members had raised the question of whether entries from operations using unvalidated methods ought to be permitted to compete at the county fair in the interest of public health. He said it smoothly, and he said it with the full weight of a man who had never in his professional life been told no by anyone who mattered in this county. Nora said, "You are telling me you intend to keep my entries out of the fair." Pruitt said he was not telling her anything. He was sharing a concern that had been raised by others. She said, "That is the same thing with extra steps, Dale." The yard was quiet again. Mercer looked at the beds and then at his shoes. Pruitt looked at Nora with the settled patience of a man who believes he owns more time than the other person. She said, "I will expect Harold to continue carrying my eggs until he has a specific and factual reason not to, and I will be addressing the matter of the fair at the next society meeting." She went inside. The screen door closed behind her. She heard Pruitt say something to Mercer, too low for her to catch. She heard Mercer's door, and then Pruitt's door, and then the Buick pulling out of her drive. She stood at the kitchen counter with her hands flat on the surface and breathed until the sound of the engine was gone. Then she opened the kitchen drawer and took out Roy's notebook. She had told herself she would know when it was time. She had not known what that would feel like. Now she knew. It felt like needing to know if she was alone in this, or whether Roy had seen it coming and had left her something she did not know she had. She sat at the table and opened the cover. First season hers and mine together. She turned the pages slowly. 30 years of careful record. Planting dates. Frost dates, yield weights. Price per bushel. The cost of seed against the revenue of harvest. The running calculation of a life built on thin margins and good judgment and constant attention to what the land was saying. Roy had written it all down, every season, every setback, every number that needed to be checked against itself. The entries became shorter in the final years. His handwriting changed, still careful, but slower each letter formed, with more deliberateness, as though he knew each one cost something. In the last dozen pages, written in a different pen than the rest, smaller and more compressed, he had written, in things that were not about the farm. He had written dates. He had written times. He had written what Pruitt had said, on what occasions, in what context, with enough specificity that anyone reading it would understand Roy had not been writing impressions, but testimony. The visits during Roy's first hospital stay, when Pruitt had come to the house and spoken to Nora about the farm's financial situation in terms Roy found deeply inappropriate, while Roy was 20 miles away and unable to respond. The offer made the month Roy came home from the hospital, the second time low enough to constitute an insult to the work of 30 years. The comment Roy had recorded in the margin of the final page, the only direct quote in the entire notebook: "This place will come to me one way or another, Roy. Sooner or later," is the only question. Roy had written the date beside it. He had written the names of 2 people who had been present when Pruitt said it. The second name was Harlan Moss. Below it in smaller writing, still Roy had written, "If I am gone before this matters, ask Harlan Moss. He has seen what I have seen. He will not say it until it is worth saying, but he will say it." Nora sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of her, and the evening coming on outside the window, and the pens moving distantly in the beds, and the sound of the birds finishing their work for the day. Roy had known. He had known for years and had spent those years quietly and carefully, the way a man who understands he may run out of time tends to what matters most. He had documented what he witnessed. He had anticipated what would come after him. He had left her a name. She closed the notebook and held it in both hands for a moment, the worn leather covers against her palms, and then she set it on the table and looked at it, and the looking was different from all the times before when she had not been able to open it. She was not reading Roy's grief now. She was reading Roy's preparation. That was a different thing entirely. She went to the society meeting on the second Thursday of August. The Grover County Agricultural Society met in the back room of the Township Hall, a low-ceilinged space with folding chairs and a table at the front, and a wall of framed photographs of prize livestock going back 40 years. There were 6 members. 4 of them owed Pruitt money or had owed it recently enough to remember. One of them, a man named Bill Cutter, had worked for Pruitt's father before working for Pruitt, and had never, to Nora's knowledge, formed an independent opinion on any agricultural subject in his adult life. The 6th was Harlan Moss. Nora had passed Moss on the county road a dozen times and nodded the way neighbors nod. She knew him as a quiet man in his late 60s who kept a solid operation on the north side of the township and said very little at public gatherings. Roy's notebook had given her a different way of seeing him, a man who had been watching something for a long time and keeping his own counsel about when to speak. She did not approach him before the meeting. She sat on the near side of the room with her composition book and waited. Pruitt arrived last, as men who control rooms often do. He took his chair at the table with the ease of someone sitting down to a meal he had already ordered. He acknowledged Nora's presence with a small nod that contained within it a kind of proprietorial amusement. The look of a man who considers an opponent's presence in his space to be a courtesy he has extended rather than a right she possesses. Nora stood when they reached her on the agenda, and she made them an offer instead of a plea. She said she had heard that questions were being raised about her production methods. She said she would not have those questions circulate without being answered in the open. She invited every person in the room and any member of the county who cared to attend to come to her property on the Saturday before the fair to inspect her operation from one end to the other, to examine her records, to dig her beds themselves, to weigh what they found against any comparable plot in Grover County. She asked to enter her produce at the fair under the same conditions as any other exhibitor, judged blind, the entries numbered and the names sealed until after the verdict, so that no one could say the result came from anything other than the quality of the food itself. The room was quiet. 6 men looked at her, and then at each other, and then at Pruitt. Pruitt said what he had come prepared to say. He spoke of public health and due diligence, and the responsibility that came with managing a fair that represented the whole county. He was smooth and thorough, and had clearly rehearsed the specific objections to each of her points. He spoke for 4 minutes without repeating himself, which was the result of practice. Harlan Moss had not said a word in the entire meeting. He sat at the far end of the table with his hands flat on the surface and looked at the middle distance, the way a man looks when he is listening to something other than what is being said. When Pruitt finished, Moss stood up. Because he was not in the habit of speaking at these meetings, his standing created a particular quality of silence, the kind that arrives when something unexpected interrupts an expected sequence. He said, "I have farmed this county 38 years. I have sat in this room for 11 of those years and watched a great deal of business get conducted." He paused. "I am going to vote yes on Mrs. Calloway's proposal. I want to say that before any other vote happens, so that it is on record where I stand." He sat back down. He did not look at Pruitt. Pruitt looked at Moss for a long moment. Moss continued to look at the middle distance. The vote came out 4-2 in Nora's favor, which surprised her less than the speed of it. The men who owed Pruitt looked at each other and at Moss, and arrived at their conclusion with the quiet efficiency of people calculating which way a thing was going before it finished going. She walked out of the township hall into the August evening with her composition book under her arm and Clem beside her, and her knees shaking, in the particular way they shook when she had been holding herself very still for a long time, and was only now allowing the tension its release. They walked to the parking area without speaking. Clem said, "He will not take that well." She said no. Clem said, "You have 8 days before the inspection." She said, "I know." He looked at her in the way he looked at soil that was doing something unexpected, reading it carefully before deciding what it meant. She said, "The ground is ready. That is what I know." She drove home in the last of the light, with all 5 pens to move in the morning and 41 linear feet of the beds still to plant before the inspection, and a name in Roy's notebook that had stood up in a room and declared itself before she had needed to ask. She did not know yet what Pruitt would do with the 8 days she had given him. She found out on a Thursday night, 2 days before the inspection was scheduled. She had planted the last section that Wednesday evening, working by the last of the light, until her knees ached and her back had opinions she chose not to listen to. The beds ran full the length of the south fence, now dark and planted, and finished everything in order for Saturday. She had gone to bed satisfied in the way that comes only from work that has been completed rather than merely stopped. The wind woke her at 11:30. Not the wind itself, but what moved inside it. The sound of the whole flock crying out at once. Every bird in all 5 pens giving voice to the same alarm in the same moment. A sound that had no resemblance to the ordinary complaints of roosting chickens, and that she recognized before she was fully conscious as something wrong. She pulled on her boots at the door and took the lantern from the hook and went out into the dark. The south bed was 60 yards from the house. She covered the distance fast and raised the lantern and saw it. The 3rd pen from the east end lay on its side, the wire bent and pulled from the frame at one corner, the door hanging open. Birds moved in every direction beyond the reach of the light, their voices frantic and high. The darkness beyond the lamp circle full of the sound of wings and running feet. The latch on the pen door had not failed. It had been opened. The hardware was intact, and the pin that held it was sitting in the dirt 4 feet from the pen, dropped rather than lost, the way a person drops something when they are moving quickly and does not care about the noise. She brought the lantern lower and read the ground. Boot prints. Deep and wide in the soft-worked soil, the kind of depth that comes from a person moving with purpose rather than standing still. The heel marks clean and the toe marks smeared, where weight had shifted forward. not an animal, not weather. Someone had come through her garden in the dark, had crossed the worked beds where the soil was softest and held impressions Best had opened the pen latch and pulled the wire loose and kept moving. At the far end, where the potato bed stood, the plants that had been coming on, thick and strong and perfectly formed, lay flat in the dirt, torn at the root, not bent. The difference between a plant that has been knocked over and a plant that has been deliberately destroyed is unmistakable to anyone who has grown things, and Nora had grown things for 30 years. She walked the length of the ruined section with the lantern held low and looked at every plant and understood exactly what had been done and why it had been done 2 days before the inspection. The best of it. That was what he had chosen. The section she had shown the society members as her example, the beds that would have produced the heaviest and most visible yield, the plants that were furthest along and most likely to impress. He had known which ones to take. He had walked this garden before tonight in the daylight with his eyes open when he had come to stand in her yard and tell her the ground was dead. She did not cry. She sat down in the ruined dirt with the lantern beside her and felt something worse than crying. The particular hollowness of a person who has built something carefully and seen it broken, not by weather or chance or the ordinary failures of farming, but by a deliberate hand. She sat in it for a while, because there was nothing useful in moving before she was ready to move. 2 choices. She could see them both from where she was sitting. The first was safe. She could withdraw her entries before the inspection. She could tell the society she had reconsidered, that the preparation had been more difficult than expected, that she would try again next year. She could meet her October debt from the eggs and the vegetable sales she already had commitments for quietly, without the fair. Pruitt would have the story he wanted, but she would still have the farm. The whisper would follow her into next year and the year after, and would sit on everything she sold like a stain she could not wash out. But she would survive it. People survived worse. The second was not safe at all. She had told the society to come and dig wherever they liked. She had said that. The ruined section was one section. It was not the whole garden. The whole garden was 40 feet of dark planted beds that the birds had worked from one end to the other across the entire season, and the only section that had been reached was the section that could be reached from the east fence without crossing the planted rows, which meant the damage was confined to the corner nearest the road. The rest of it was untouched, but there was more than that. The prints were deep and clean and specific, pressed into soil that held impressions the way no other soil in Grover County held them, because no other soil in Grover County had been made the same way. She had built this soil from nothing across one season. She had fed it and turned it and worked it from gray, dead clay into dark living material through a process that no one else in this county had used. The soil composition under these beds was unlike anything else within 20 miles, and the prints in it were unlike anything left in any other field, because there was no other field like this one. She thought about the boots. Wide at the toe, high at the heel, the mark of a leather sole, rather than a rubber one. The kind of boots a man wore with a vest and a clean hat on a Tuesday morning when he came to tell a woman her ground was dead, and she was the last one to know it. The lantern flickered. Somewhere in the dark beyond its reach, a hen called, and another answered. She had 2 choices, and she had been sitting here long enough to know she had only ever had one. She got up off the ground. She went to Clem's house before the sun was fully up, walking fast on the creek path, with the dew coming through her boots. He met her at the door before she knocked, which meant he had heard the birds the night before and had been waiting. She told him what she had found. He listened without interrupting. His face went through something while she spoke a slow, tightening, that started at the jaw and moved up, and by the time she finished, he had the expression of a man who has been patient about something for a very long time and has now been given permission to stop. He said, "You left the prints." She said, "I did not touch them." He said, "Good." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from me today?" She said, "Help me find every bird that is loose before the light gets full, and then I need you to come Saturday and stand where everyone can see you." He nodded. He went inside for his boots. They spent Friday recovering the scattered birds, moving through the beds and the surrounding ground, in the early morning, gathering. The ones that had gone to roost in the bean rows, and the ones that had pushed under the fence into the neighbor's field, and the 3 that had made it as far as the road ditch and were standing there in the gravel, looking confused about their evening. By noon, they had all but 2, and by late afternoon, they had those as well. Nora repaired the bent wire and reset the pen, and said nothing to anyone about what had happened. She did not send word to the society. She did not make any report. She left the ruined potato beds exactly as they were, every plant flat and torn, every boot print intact in the dark soil. The scene preserved the way Roy had preserved things carefully and for a purpose. That evening, Pete Sims came into the Grover Mercantile while Nora was picking up flour and did something she had not expected. She was at the counter when he came in, and Mercer was behind it, with the careful politeness he had been performing since Pruitt's visit, pleasant enough but not quite meeting her eyes when he spoke. Pete came in and looked at the display shelf by the register where the local eggs were kept and picked up a carton with the Callaway name on the label. He set it on the counter. He said he wanted 2 more of those. He did not look at Nora. He looked at the cartons and then at Mercer. Mercer got the 2 cartons without speaking. Pete paid for them and carried all 3 out under his arm and got in his truck. Nora watched through the window as he pulled out of the lot. She understood what he had not said and what it had cost him to come here and say it this way quietly and in public and without acknowledgement, because the way he had said it meant Mercer had witnessed it, and Mercer would remember it and would have to account for it if the question of her eggs came up in his store again. She carried her flour home and did not sleep much, but what sleep she got was better than the night before. Saturday arrived clear and sharp, the kind of morning that comes at the end of a Kansas summer, when the heat finally admits what is coming. The sky was high and blue, and the light came in at an angle that made everything look slightly more itself than usual. The green of the beds greener, the dark of the soil, darker the fence lines clean and exact against the open air. They came in a procession the way she had known they would. 6 society members in their good clothes. Mercer from the Mercantile, the neighbor woman, who had carried Pruitt's warning to her in July, and had done it with genuine discomfort, the county officer, whose presence she had requested specifically because she wanted a witness with no stake in the outcome. And Pruitt arriving last in the Buick, parking at the road, rather than the drive, walking in, with the settled ease of a man attending a proceeding, whose result he already knows. A good number of township residents came behind them, drawn by the particular gravity that forms around a public reckoning. The ones who had laughed in the spring, and the ones who had been quietly watching all summer, and the ones who had heard various versions of the story and wanted to know which version was true. Nora met them at the gate with her composition book and a clean spade and a face she had been working to keep still since 5 that morning. She said, "You came to look, and you are welcome to all of it. The birds are in their pens. My records are here for anyone who wants them. And the ground is the ground. Dig wherever you like." She said the last part with care because it mattered. She did not steer them. She offered no suggestions about which section would show best. A test that the subject chooses the conditions of is not a test at all, and she had understood that from the beginning. The society members looked at each other and at the long rows of beds in front of them, with the awkward formality of men who had agreed to do something in a meeting room that felt different now that the doing of it was in front of them. The neighbor woman solved the hesitation by taking the spade out of Nora's hands and driving it into the nearest bed with a decisive push. What came up stopped the conversation. A nest of potatoes the size of a man's fist. 8 of them from a single hill, clean and heavy, and so much larger than anything any of the men had dug from their own ground this season, that the sound that went through the group was not polite. It was genuine. The sound of people encountering something that contradicts what they had been prepared to find. After that, they dug in earnest. The county officer worked methodically down the rows while 2 society members took opposite ends of the bed. Everywhere the spade went, the answer was the same. Hill after hill, the yields came up heavy and clean. The bean rows were hanging so thick that 2 of the men stopped to look more closely at the stems, checking for the structural reality of what they were seeing. The squash had gone beyond what the beds could gracefully contain, and was spreading its broad leaves into the paths with the quiet authority of something that has been given everything it needs. The officer wrote those numbers in his record book and read them back as he went, and the numbers climbed past the best season Nora had seen on this land in 30 years, past the best season she had heard anyone in the county describe in recent memory. The crowd warmed the way crowds warm when they have been told what to think and then discover they have eyes of their own. The murmur changed in quality from the careful kind to the open kind. Pruitt had positioned himself at the far end of the group, near the east corner, where the ruined beds lay visible from across the garden, and Nora had been aware of him there from the moment she opened the gate. She had watched him in the way you watch a weather system that is moving toward you, tracking its direction without looking at it directly. She had seen his expression tighten as the numbers came in. She had seen the moment his eyes settled on the east corner, and she had known from the set of his shoulders that he was going to use it. She had been waiting for him to use it. She had built the space for him to use it deliberately and with full understanding of what would happen when he did. He called out from the far end when the officer was reading a particularly large yield figure from the potato section. He said it loud enough for the whole group to hear. He said, "That is all very well, but what about the far corner?" He gestured toward the east end, where the ruined beds lay flat and obvious in the morning light. "Funny, she walked us past that section. Looks to me like not everything in this garden did so well. Looks to me like something went wrong down there. Could be the method has some limits. She has not been advertising." He said it with the confidence of a man who has made this kind of move before and watched it work. Everyone turned to look at the ruined beds. Nora walked to the east corner without hurrying, and the group followed the way. Groups follow when they sense the center of a thing shifting. She stopped at the edge of the damaged section and crouched down over the torn plants and waited for the group to gather around her. She let the silence sit for a moment, not filling it, not rushing to explain because the silence was working for her. She said without raising her voice so that people leaned in to hear her. Over the morning air, it did not fail. Look at the plants. She picked up the stem of the nearest torn potato plant and held it so the group could see the root end. The roots were not rotted. They were not dried. They were healthy and intact, pulled cleanly from the ground. She said, "A crop does not tear itself up by the root. Something tore this. And look at the ground around it." She placed her own boot beside one of the deep impressions in the soil. Her boot was a size 7, narrow, flat-heeled, the boot of a woman who works on her feet. The impression beside it was a size 11 at minimum wide across the ball, with a heel that had sunk nearly 2 inches into the soft surface. The mark of a leather sole with a built-up heel, the kind of heel that comes on a boot that costs $200 and is not made for kneeling in soil. She said, "Those are not my prints, and they are not from any animal I keep." The county officer crouched beside the prints with the care of a man who understands that what he is looking at may matter later. He set his own boot on the edge of the impression, not inside it, and looked at the dimensions. Then he stood and looked at the feet of the people standing in the circle around the bed. He looked at each pair of boots in turn. He took his time. He was a thorough man who understood the value of being seen to be thorough. His gaze moved around the circle and arrived last at Dale Pruitt. Pruitt was wearing the brown leather boots he always wore, the good ones polished and clean on the shaft and the toe. Clean everywhere except the sole and the heel, where the dark, rich soil of Nora's worked beds was packed into the welt and crusted around the edge of the heel in the specific way that soft, deep soil packs when a person walks through it with weight and purpose. Soil that was unlike any other soil in Grover County. Soil that had been built from nothing over one season by a process no one else in the township had used. Soil that could not have come from any other garden, any other field, any other yard within 20 miles of where they were standing. Pruitt looked down. The color left his face the way water leaves low ground. Not all at once, but irreversibly, and once it started, it did not stop. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He was a man who had never in 30 years of doing business in this county run out of the right thing to say at the right moment, and the fact that he could not locate any words at all in this particular moment was visible to every person standing in that circle. And every person in that circle understood exactly what it meant. Harlan Moss stepped forward from the outer edge of the group where he had been standing, without drawing attention to himself since the inspection began. He was carrying a small notebook, narrow and cardboard covered, the kind sold at the hardware store for $1. He opened it. He said, "I want to read something into the record while we have a county officer present to hear it." He read dates. He read them in order starting from a summer 11 years ago and moving forward through the years with the precision of a man who had written these things down at the time they happened, not reconstructed them afterward. A Tuesday evening in June, late, when he had seen Pruitt's vehicle parked on the service road behind the Coulter property, 2 days before Ed Coulter's experimental planting was destroyed. A November night, 3 years later, when he had observed the same vehicle on the far side of the Gruber place. 48 hours before Tom Gruber received an early payment demand on his note that Tom had not been expecting. 5 more entries after those specific and dated each one, a quiet, careful observation made by a man who had understood for a long time what he was watching and had chosen to write it down rather than speak it before the moment was right to be heard. He closed the notebook. He said, "Roy Calloway asked me to keep these records. He said a day would come when they would matter. I told him I would keep them as long as it took. I have kept them 11 years. I am done keeping them now." The circle of people around the ruined bed had gone very still. Not the polite stillness of a meeting room, but the deeper stillness of people who have understood something that rearranges what they thought they knew. Several of the men were looking at Pruitt with an expression that had nothing social in it. Mercer was looking at his boots again, but differently than before. Pruitt said, "Harlan, I do not know what you think you saw." Moss said, "I know what I saw, Dale. I wrote it down the same night every time. That is the difference between us." Pruitt looked at the circle of faces. He had spent 30 years learning to read a room, and he could read this one. There was nothing left in it for him. The men who had voted with him at the society meeting were looking at the ground, or at each other, and not at him. The county officer had his notebook open and his pen in his hand. The crowd that had come from the township to watch was watching with the particular attention of people who will be describing this day to others for the rest of their lives. He turned and walked through the circle toward the gate. The crowd parted without being asked the way. People make room for something they do not want to be near, and he walked out through the gate and down the drive to the Buick, and the Buick started and backed out to the road and drove away. No one said anything until the sound of the engine was completely gone. Then someone started talking, and everyone started talking, and the county officer went back to his record book, and the morning went on. The fair was the following Saturday. The entries were numbered and the names sealed in envelopes held by the officer, and the judging was done by a man brought in from the neighboring county who had no connection to Grover and no knowledge of whose produce was whose. The tables in the exhibition hall were loaded with the best of what 40 farms had produced across a full season. Nora's entries went in as numbers, not names. The judge lifted the basket of potatoes and could not speak for a moment. He set them down and looked at them from a slight distance, the way a person looks at something they want to see accurately rather than just confirm. He went down the table. He came back. He made his notes. When the envelopes were opened and the names read out, the sound that went through the hall was not polite applause. It started in the back where people were standing and came forward, and by the time it reached the front, it had become the kind of sound that a person feels in the chest rather than hears with the ears. 3 ribbons. Blue for potatoes, blue for beans, blue for squash. The best in the county in all 3 categories, judged by a man who did not know whose they were and had no reason to decide anyway. But honestly, Nora stood at the table with the 3 ribbons in her hand and did not quite know for a moment what to do with her face. She had spent so many months holding it still that the stillness had become a habit, and now the thing she had been holding it still against had resolved itself, and she did not immediately know what expression belonged to this. The neighbor woman who had carried Pruitt's warning to her in July pressed her hand without speaking, and this time the pressure was different from all the careful pressings before it. It was just one person's hand. In another person's hand, nothing underneath it, but the acknowledgement of what it had cost to get from there to here. Clem was standing near the door because he was not comfortable in crowds and never had been. She found him there and held up the 3 ribbons, and he looked at them and then at her with an expression that had very little to do with ribbons, and she understood it exactly. Outside the hall, the October air was cold and clean, and the leaves on the cottonwoods along the creek road had gone gold overnight, the way they did every year, as though they had been waiting for exactly this temperature to become what they were supposed to be. In the weeks that followed, the county officer filed a formal report. The matter went to the township authority and then to the state. Dale Pruitt did not attend the subsequent hearings in person. His lawyer attended instead, and the language of the proceedings was specific and careful, and none of it was about potatoes or chickens or the quality of anyone's soil. It was about property and access, and the deliberate destruction of another person's agricultural operation and the papers that Harlan Moss provided. 11 years of dated observations in a cardboard notebook were entered into the record and treated as the primary evidence they were. The debt instrument Pruitt held on the Callaway account was voided. As part of the settlement proceedings, a consequence his lawyer had apparently not anticipated when he structured the original arrangement. Pruitt did not lose his business that fall. He lost something harder to recover from. He lost the certainty that the county would defer to him, and once that certainty was gone, the business operated differently, because the business had never been only about seed and feed. It had been about who people believed when it mattered. And that had changed in a garden on a Saturday morning in September in front of everyone who needed to see it. The following spring, Nora was at her east fence before the light was fully up, watching the first of the season's pens move slowly down beds so dark they looked black against the pale morning sky. 5 pens running 40 feet of planted beds behind them, the birds working with the settled expertise of animals that have been doing something long enough to be good at it. The smell of the soil came up in the cool air, the way it had come up every morning since that first evening when she had pressed her hands flat against it and felt it give. She was not alone at the fence. 3 women from neighboring farms stood with her, all of them with paper and pencil, asking about the frame dimensions and the wire gauge and the wheel placement and how she managed the rotation timing when rain pushed the schedule back. A young farmer who had been carrying Pruitt's note for 4 years was down at the far end of the bed with a borrowed ledger, sketching the pen design with the focused attention of a man who has finally found the thing he was looking for. Vera Sims had come through the front gate that morning and parked her car at the front of the drive the first time she had parked there, rather than at the road or the side gate. Pete was in the truck. He had sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel, and then opened the door and gotten out. He was not a man who made speeches, and he did not make one now. He walked down to where Nora was standing and looked at the pens and the beds, and the birds doing their patient, methodical work in the early light. And after a while he said, without looking at her directly, whether a man could learn to build one of those. Nora watched the nearest pen move forward 6 feet as she lifted the handles and set it down on fresh ground. The birds fell to work immediately, not needing to be told, because they had been doing this long enough to understand what fresh ground meant. She said, "Everybody can learn. That is the whole point." Clem came up the lane, late as always, waving his hat in the morning air, moving with the slight, careful gait he had developed since his back episode, but moving coming on. He had a jar of something under his arm that turned out to be last summer's preserved blackberries, which he set on the fence post without explanation, the way he always brought things, as though the bringing were simply a fact of the morning, rather than a gesture that meant anything. Nora looked at the lane and the fence, and the people gathered at it, and then at the beds dark and alive, and full of the promise of a season that had not yet been decided. She thought about Roy's first entry in the leather notebook. She thought about what it had meant to him to write those words on the first page of 30 years of careful record, the 2 of them starting out together, on ground neither of them knew how to read yet. Nothing is worthless. Roy's mother had said a woman Nora had known only through Roy's stories and the few times she had heard him say the phrase in the way people repeat things that have reorganized how they see. Nothing is worthless. There are only people who have not learned to read it yet. The ground had known what it was capable of, long before anyone asked it the right question. It had been waiting gray and packed and patient for someone to come along stubborn enough and desperate enough and finally clear-eyed enough to ask. She had asked. The ground had answered. And the answer was still coming in.